Hello, classes. This is Mr. Burnett. We're going to have a pretty short lecture for this one. We're just going to talk about some of the key policies that arose after Ulysses Grant became president. As you remember, our last lecture ended with the almost impeachment of Andrew Johnson. The Senate fell one vote shy of impeaching him, but then he wasn't even nominated by the Democratic Party to run again for president in 1868. So Grant, who ran as the Republican candidate and is still the most popular person in the North based on the Union victory in the Civil War, Grant wins the presidency, becomes our 18th president, as the number here on the screen indicates. And I just want to talk, like I say, this will probably just be a few minutes. We're going to talk briefly about some of the key pieces of legislation under Grant, and then some key terminology from the Reconstruction. All right, so probably the most important thing that happened during the Grant administration is actually something that really happened right before he took office. The radical Republicans in Congress were able to pass the 15th Amendment. Now, do you remember from all of our previous discussions, amendments, they have to be passed by 2/3 of Congress, but then to go into effect, 3/4 of the states have to ratify them. So Congress had passed the 15th Amendment right before Grant takes office. The amendment doesn't get ratified by the states until 1870, so in the second year of Grant's administration. And 15th Amendment takes care of, or at least it tries to take care of, the problems that were developing in the former Confederate states with respect to the voting rights of the African Americans. As you recall from our past lectures, I described what was happening during Reconstruction to be like a type of tennis match or ping pong game. The radical Republicans and the northern states and federal Congress would pass a law trying to help the former slaves, trying to provide political rights to African Americans, and the southern states would hit the ball back by passing black codes and using other forms of discrimination and intimidation to take those rights away. And the 15th Amendment's another one of these events. This time it's the federal government's and radical Republicans' turn to try to pass law protecting rights for African Americans. And what the 15th Amendment does is it guarantees men's right to vote regardless of race. Once again, it just applies to voting rights only apply to men during the 1800s. It'll have to be in the, I believe, 19th Amendment in 1919 and 1920. That finally gets ratified for women to gain the right to vote. But the 15th Amendment does extend voting rights towards African Americans. And there's another important piece of the 15th Amendment, which specifically states that Congress has the right to pass any law needed to enforce voting rights. All right, so if you remember when we talked about the Constitution, Congress has limited powers. It really only has the power to deal with commerce, coin money, levy taxes, ratify treaties, declare war. Those are things. Remember, Congress has a very limited set of powers and rights available to it under the Constitution. Plus, you have the whole federalism angle where certain rights and powers are reserved for the states. So the 15th Amendment gives Congress extra power. All right, so you don't have to tie this to regulating commerce or coining money or anything like that. The 15th Amendment expands the power of Congress to pass laws basically relating to voting rights. And this will immediately become important because perhaps the key legislative accomplishment during the Grant presidency is going to be what are officially called the Enforcement Acts, of 1870, 1871. They're also known as the Ku Klux Klan Acts, for reasons I'm about to explain. So what were they? In effect, these acts made it a crime to deny civil, political, or voting rights to someone based on their race. All right, so the 15th Amendment said, states aren't allowed to deny voting rights to people based on their race. But again, that's setting out that people have a right to vote. But what's the remedy if you can't vote? People deny their voting rights, could perhaps sue, but by then the election would be over. So the federal government and Grant really thought it was necessary to come up with another piece of legislation that would allow the government to enforce these rights. Because they knew the southern states were going to prevent African Americans from voting if they could. They were often doing this through violence and intimidation carried out by the Ku Klux Klan, which is why these acts are called the Ku Klux Klan Acts. And specifically, that acts outlaw forming groups and wearing disguises to violate someone's constitutional rights. So they very much were aimed at the type of intimidation tactics and violent tactics that the Ku Klux Klan was using to try to strip away and prevent African Americans from obtaining the rights that are now set out in the Constitution. Because remember, you now have three acts or three amendments passed during Reconstruction. You have the 13th Amendment, which outlawed slavery. You have the 14th Amendment, which basically guarantees equal protection of the law and due process rights to people regardless of race. And now you have the 15th Amendment specifically promising voting rights. And one of the final pieces of these enforcement acts, of the Ku Klux Klan Acts, and perhaps the piece that really angered people in the South the most, was it allowed the president to use the U.S. military to enforce these acts. And some people made the analogy back to the Alien and Sedition Acts. So if you remember way back when we talked about the John Adams presidency, he passed the Alien and Sedition Acts, and that allowed the president, i.e. John Adams, to basically deport or at least detain and possibly deport aliens, immigrants that he thought were a danger to the country. This enforcement act basically gives Grant the power to decide, okay, well, this state's not allowing African Americans to vote as they should, so I'm going to send them to the military. Some people at the time, particularly in the South, drew that analogy and tried to say, oh, okay, well, look, Grant is doing what John Adams did. But obviously, the circumstances are very, very different. John Adams was trying to basically keep people from voting through the Alien and Sedition Acts by deporting people he thought were going to vote for Jefferson, whereas Grant is trying to protect people's rights. So in effect, these laws are very, very much different. The circumstances are extremely different. But nonetheless, people in the South hated these acts, and so they used these analogies, that Grant was trying to overstep the bounds of presidential power, etc. But these are, as I said, probably the key legislative requirements taken or legislative accomplishments taken during the Grant administration, because they did show pretty early on in his presidency that he was different than Andrew Johnson. It's clear Andrew Johnson did not at all care to try to protect the rights of former slaves and African Americans. But Grant shows early on that he's different. He is going to do what he can to try to bring about the extension of political rights to the former slaves and to all African Americans. So it's a big signal that Grant's quite a bit different than Andrew Johnson, and that the South has a much more forceful opponent in the presidency than they did when Andrew Johnson was the president. It's not to say that Grant's going to be able to solve all the problems that were going on in the South, and as we'll learn in our next and last lecture on Reconstruction. He ultimately was unable to solve all of the racism and the denial of rights that were happening in the southern states. But the Enforcement Act shows that he's at least going to try. And as we'll show in our next lecture, they did in fact have some success. All right, but before we get to those issues, that'll be in the next lecture, and before we wrap up this lecture, let's just talk about some key vocabulary that came out of the Reconstruction time period. All right, now it's one thing for Grant and the radical Republicans to write laws down on a piece of paper, in the Capitol there in Washington, D.C. But you have to actually enforce them. You have to have people carrying out these policies. And so many people from the North, whether it was working for the Freedmen's Bureau or just working for the federal government to enforce these policies, moved to the South during this time period. And Southerners created nicknames, not at all meant to be friendly or complimentary, but Southerners created nicknames for these persons. One, the most famous, you may still hear it from time to time today, that's carpetbaggers. This is a name for people from the North who moved to the South to carry out Reconstruction, because Southerners said that the bags the Northerners were carrying, their suitcases, looked like they were made out of carpet. A lot of them created out of some fabric that reminded Southerners of carpet. So the Southerners thought they were carrying carpet bags and basically started referring to any of the Northerners carrying out Reconstruction policies as carpetbaggers. So remember that term. And like I say, from time to time, you will still hear people in the South refer to Northerners who are living down here as carpetbaggers. So that term has existed long past Reconstruction. The second term is scalawags. Those were the names Southerners used for other Southerners who supported Reconstruction policies. So I talk a lot about the North versus the South and the federal government versus the Southern states in these Reconstruction lessons. But as always, that's somewhat of a generalization. It's not like there weren't anyone in the South who supported Reconstruction and who were actively trying to help the federal government get the country put back together again. It's just that those people were in the minority, and the vast majority of Southerners opposed Reconstruction. So they thought any Southerner who tried to help Reconstruction along was a traitor, and they came up with this name, scalawags. All right, I told you this lecture would be short. That's it for this lecture. Next time we will talk about the legacy of Reconstruction and how it ended.